A lot of issues will be discussed during this G7 summit, and one of the major topics would be China. The West has a number of issues with Beijing, and it seems that they have finally decided to take a stand. It's not just some simple rebuke this time. The West seems to have launched a multi-dimensional attack on China, on the Chinese economy and their diplomatic aggression, basically just short of an actual physical confrontation. A number of attacks, in fact, have been launched back-to-back. Let's start with the EU's move.
The Commission has also pre-disclosed today the level of provisional countervailing duties it would impose on imports of battery electric vehicles from China.
The European Union is imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. These tariffs will range from about 17% to a whopping 38%. Major Chinese companies will face these tariffs like BYD, SAIC, Geely and others. Chinese EVs have been gaining ground in the European Union. In 2019, their market share was just 1%, but now it's closer to 8%. The reason for this growth was the cheap prices. Chinese EVs typically cost 20% less than the European ones. So the EU has decided to nullify China's price advantage. As you can imagine, Beijing is not happy about this.
What I want to emphasize is that this anti-subsidy investigation is a typical case of protectionism. China will take all necessary measures to firmly safeguard its legitimate rights and interests.
Beijing has issued a warning. The EU tariffs could start a chain reaction, possibly a trade war, but the Europeans will have support from their biggest backer, and that is the United States of America. Washington had announced a similar tariff hike last month. US tariffs on Chinese EVs were increased to 100%. So Europe still lags behind. But it's a clear signal that the West is united in its opposition to China. So that was one battlefront, Chinese electric vehicles. The next one is advanced computer chips. The US has been fighting a chip war with China since 2022. It has been trying to restrict Beijing's access to advanced chips, like the ones used to power artificial intelligence technology. It seems the US is planning to up the ante. It is planning a new round of restrictions, not just on American-made chips, but also on chips made using American technology. There's a technology called Gate-All-Around, or GAA. It is used to improve chip performance and reduce power consumption. And this technology is patented. So the US wants to block the exports of anything made using this tech. It would be another blow to China's chip sector, marking an escalation in the US-China chip war, and that is the second prong of the Western attack, advanced computer chips. The third prong is less direct. It involves sanctions against Russia. The US is planning more sanctions, and this time Chinese firms will become collateral damage. The US believes that China is helping Russia evade sanctions. It says Chinese firms are sending microchips, drone parts and weapon components to Russia. So a few dozen Chinese firms were sanctioned yesterday. This won't stop the evasion though, but it does send a message. Biden is sanctioning China on the eve of the G7 summit. He will want the EU to follow suit. And if Europe joins in on the sanctions, Beijing will have to deal with another battlefront. So EVs, chips and sanctions. These are the West's economic targets. But the US and Canada have begun a diplomatic assault as well. After decades, they're reviving the issue of Tibet. Yesterday, the US Congress passed a bill. It urges Beijing to re-engage with the Dalai Lama to find a resolution to the China-Tibet dispute. The American bill comes on the heels of a Canadian one. The Canadian Parliament passed a motion on Monday. They unanimously supported the Tibetan people's right to self-determination. Both these acts are symbolic. Canada and the US cannot force China to free Tibet, but bringing up the issue could make China uncomfortable and throw some light on Beijing's imperialistic behavior. And that is another attack. The fourth in a few days. It shows that the West is trying to corner Beijing to apply pressure. But will it work? Will Beijing back down amid a multi-pronged attack? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Fan of Italy's famous cuisine? Well, we are serving it with a side of diplomacy. As the G7 leaders gather in southern Italy, Vantage is taking you to the heart of the action. What's the agenda? Who is invited? And how is Italy preparing for it? Catch the special edition of Vantage throughout this week, only on Firstpost. Fan of Italy's famous cuisine? Well, we are serving it with a side of diplomacy. As G7 leaders gather in southern Italy, Vantage is taking you to the heart of the action. What's the agenda? Who's invited? And how is Italy preparing for it? Catch the special edition of Vantage throughout this week, only on Firstpost.